4 days after I buried my wife, my son Scott had a real estate app open at my kitchen table. I'm not exaggerating. 4 days. Carol's coffee mug was still on the counter, the one with the chipped handle she refused to throw away. Her reading glasses were still folded on the nightstand upstairs. The sympathy cards people had dropped off were still stacked on the dining room table, unopened. And Scott was sitting in my kitchen, phone tilted toward his wife Linda. I'm pointing at something on the screen and saying the words lot size and spring market. I was 64 years old. I'd spent 35 years pulling wire and running crews on commercial job sites across central Ohio. I'd worked with my hands my whole life. I knew when something was being set up, and I knew when to stay quiet and let it run. I stayed quiet. I poured my coffee, stood by the sink, and listened. "The detached garage adds real value," Scott was saying. "And the neighborhood comps have been strong. If we list in April, we're looking at serious numbers." Linda had a notepad out. She was writing things down. I set my mug on the counter. "Scott," he looked up. Not quite at me, more like in my direction. "Dad, we've been over this. A house this size is a lot for one person to manage. I managed it for 27 years. You managed it with Mom." He said it like that ended the conversation. Like Carol's absence had automatically handed him some kind of authority over the situation. I didn't argue, and I let them finish their coffee. I walked them to the door. I stood on the front porch in the cold November air and watched their rental car disappear around the corner. Then I went back inside, washed the mugs, and went to bed. That was the beginning of it. Her name was Carol Ann Merritt. She was 61 years old when she died. She'd been a pediatric nurse for 28 years, and before that she was just the kind of person who made everything work without making a big deal out of it. We met in 1983 at a backyard cookout at a mutual friend's place in Westerville. She was the one who'd brought extra chairs because she knew there wouldn't be enough. I asked her if she wanted to take a walk around the block because it was too loud inside. She said yes. We were married 14 months later. We had Scott in 1987. My brother Ray's boy, Neil Callahan. Ray passed in 2011. Neil grew up in and out of our house after that. Carol made sure of it. She packed his lunches when Ray's wife was working nights. She drove him to track practice. She showed up to his college graduation even when she was already dealing with the fatigue she wasn't telling anyone about yet. Neil was 29 now, working as a law clerk in Hamilton, Ontario, just across the border. Solid kid. Ray would have been proud. Scott had moved to Dallas in 2016 with Linda. They came back for holidays, called on birthdays. When Carol got her diagnosis in 2021, they called more. When she declined faster than any of us expected, they visited more. After she passed, they stayed. That's where the trouble started. The week after the funeral, Linda asked me, very casually, whether I'd spoken to a financial planner recently. I said I hadn't felt the need. She nodded slowly. The kind of nod that means the person thinks you've said something concerning. 3 days after that, Scott sat me down with charts on his phone and explained that the house was, his word, a liability. As he mentioned a place called Cloverfield Commons, an active senior community about 20 minutes east of Columbus. He showed me photos of the lobby. Nice lobby. Lots of natural light. "I'm 64, I told him. "I just lost your mother. I'm not moving anywhere." He let it go for about a week. Then he came back with paperwork. He said it was a standard power of attorney, just so he could help me manage accounts and paperwork if anything came up. He was calm about it. Practical. He used the word efficient twice. I was still not sleeping well at that point. I was still finding Carol's handwriting on things around the house, a grocery list on the fridge, a note tucked in a library book she'd never finished. I was not in the clearest headspace. I almost signed it. Neil was sitting at the kitchen table that afternoon, quiet the way he usually is. He'd been coming around more since the funeral, not making a production of it, just showing up. After Scott left, Neil picked up the paperwork and looked it over for about a minute. Then he set it back down and said, "Don't sign this, Gary." I asked him why. Because this isn't limited power of attorney. This gives him full authority, accounts, real property decisions, everything. Did he explain that to you? He had not explained that to me. I put the paperwork in the kitchen drawer. I didn't bring it up with Scott again, but I started paying closer attention to everything else. Carol and I had a joint checking account. We'd run everything through it for 41 years. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, repairs, all of it. When her first health scare hit back in 2018, we added Scott as a secondary account holder so he could help manage bills if something happened to both of us at once. It made sense at the time. We trusted him. He was our son. The access stayed on the account after Carol passed. I hadn't gotten around to changing it yet. I was dealing with other things. And the first transfer showed up in early December. $3,200, moved to an account number I didn't recognize. I called the bank. The transaction had been authorized from an IP address in Dallas. Scott's address. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that call. I didn't call Scott. I didn't say anything to anyone except Neil. I called Neil that evening and told him what I'd found. He went quiet for a moment. He does that when he's thinking. And then he said, "How long do you want to wait before you do something about it?" I said, "Long enough to know how much." So I waited. I checked the account every few days. The transfers kept coming. Small amounts, irregular intervals. $2,800 here, $4,100 there, sometimes nothing for 10 days, then 2 transfers in a week. Whoever was doing this was being careful about it, methodical, was trying to stay below the threshold that triggers automatic bank flags. By mid-January, the total had reached $41,000. I wrote the number down on a notepad and sat with it for a while. $41,000. That wasn't desperation money. That was planned money. You don't move $41,000 in careful, irregular increments over 6 weeks without a plan behind it. Neil had done some digging by then. He had a talent for finding things out without making noise about it. What he found was that Scott had been carrying serious debt from a failed business partnership in Dallas. Around $85,000 owed to a former partner. The business had collapsed in 2022. Scott had never mentioned any of it to me, not once. I thought back to 2019. Scott had called me asking for a $20,000 loan. He'd said it was for a business opportunity, kept the details vague. I'd told him no. I told him a man learns more from working through his own problems than from having them solved for him. I meant it sincerely. I still believe it. But I understood now that he had not received it that way. He'd held on to it. And when Carol died and left him with what he saw as an opportunity, he moved on it fast. None of that excuses what he did. But it explains it. And I think explanations matter. It was Neil who suggested I check the shared family email account. Years ago, Carol and I had set up a joint email for travel bookings, subscription services, things we both needed access to. Scott still knew the login. We'd never changed it. I hadn't thought about it. I opened the sent folder one evening while Neil was sitting across from me at the kitchen table. And there it was. An email Scott had sent to a real estate broker in Columbus. The timestamp was 3 weeks before Carol died. Subject line, family property, initial inquiry. I read it once, then read it again. The email said, in plain, a business-like language, that his father would likely be agreeable to transitioning into a senior living situation within a few months of his mother's passing, and that he wanted to discuss timing and initial valuation in advance. He had included the address of our house. He had asked about commission structures. He wrote that email while Carol was still alive. I didn't say anything for a minute. Neil was watching me. I printed the email, folded it, and put it in the same kitchen drawer as the power of attorney paperwork. Then I looked at Neil and said, "I'm going to need Diane Hollis's number." Diane Hollis had been my estate attorney since 2004. She was not a warm person. She was the kind of lawyer who got straight to the point and expected you to keep up. But she was thorough, and thorough was exactly what I needed right now. I called her the next morning. I laid out everything. The power of attorney Scott had pushed me to sign, the $41,000 in transfers, the email to the real estate broker. In any of that, I need to tell you something. Any of that, I need to tell you something Carol asked me to keep confidential until the right moment. I think this is the right moment. I told her to go ahead. Carol came to see me in February of 2023. She updated her estate planning, will, beneficiary designations, everything. She was thorough about it. I assumed she'd discussed the details with you. I said she'd mentioned some things in general terms. She purchased a property, Diane said. A cabin on the Bruce Peninsula in Ontario, near Tobermory. She bought it in September 2020, using funds from her aunt's inheritance and savings she'd accumulated in a separate account. She registered it solely in her name. In her estate, it passes solely to you. Scott is not referenced anywhere in the document. I didn't say anything. She also updated her life insurance beneficiary designations in February 2023, Diane continued. You are named primary. Neil Callahan is named secondary. Scott is not named. The kitchen was very quiet. Gary, Diane said, your wife knew what she was doing. Every bit of it. I set the phone down on the table after we hung up and just sat there. Outside the window, the backyard looked exactly the same as it always had. The old oak in the corner, and the garden beds Carol had put in 12 years ago, now buried under a foot of January snow. Everything looked the same. But something had shifted completely. Carol had known. She hadn't known everything. Maybe not the scale of it, not the $41,000, not the email to the broker. But she had known her son well enough to build a wall around me before she left. She had done it quietly, without telling me, without worrying me while she was still here. I sat with that for a long time. I didn't tell Scott any of it. Not about Diane's call. Not about the cabin. Not about the fact that I'd been tracking every transfer out of that joint account for 6 weeks and had the record sitting in a folder in my desk drawer. I said nothing. I kept answering his calls the same way I always had. Short, civil, non-committal. He'd ask how I was doing. I'd say fine. He'd mention the house, something casual, something that sounded like he was just thinking out loud. I'd say I was still working through things. He seemed satisfied with that, and it told me he thought he had time. He didn't have time. The Wednesday after I spoke with Diane, I called a locksmith while Scott and Linda were at lunch with friends across town. Front door, back door, side entry to the garage, all three rekeyed. New deadbolts on the front and back. I paid cash. Then I called the bank. Diane had already drafted the necessary paperwork. With her documentation, I formally removed Scott as a secondary account holder on the joint checking account. It took less than an hour. And the remaining balance, minus what I kept for current expenses, was transferred that same afternoon into a new account in my name only. Scott did not receive a notification. The bank had no obligation to inform a removed secondary holder. Diane had confirmed that before I made the call. Then I started packing. I wasn't in a rush about it. Rushing would have tipped things off. I had time, and I used it carefully. The first things to go were the things that mattered most. Carol's photographs, the ones that had been on the mantel, and the hallway, and the bookshelf in the den. Her books. The small cedar box she kept on her dresser. The one with the letters we'd written each other in the early years of our marriage, before email made letters feel unnecessary. Those went into a duffel bag first, then my tools, my files, the practical things a man accumulates over 35 years of working with his hands. Neil had connected me with a small moving company out of Hamilton. Reliable people, discreet, no questions asked. We worked 3 weekends, Saturday mornings, early, before the neighborhood was awake. A truckload at a time, up the highway and across the border into Ontario. While all of this was happening, Scott called twice to mention that Linda's cousin, a real estate agent, had been doing some preliminary research on comparable properties in our zip code. He kept framing it as helpful. Just information, just so I'd have the full picture when I was ready to think things through. I thanked him. I said that was thoughtful. The cabin was a 3-bedroom cedar log house on 4 acres of wooded land outside Tobermory, Ontario, about 8 minutes from the harbor, with a wood stove, a drilled well, and a screened porch on the north side that looked out over the tree line toward Georgian Bay. Carol had bought it outright in September 2020 for $340,000. Better using the inheritance from her Aunt Ruth and savings she'd built up quietly in an account I hadn't known the full scope of. She had registered it in her name alone. I had never seen it before the second week of January, when I pulled into the gravel driveway in my truck with the last load from Columbus and cut the engine. I sat there for a minute. Snow on the roof, snow on the birches along the edge of the property. The porch light was off, and the windows were dark, and the whole place was exactly as quiet as you'd want it to be, after the last 3 months I'd had. I let myself in with the key Diane had couriered to me. The inside smelled like cedar and cold air, and a wood fire that had been out for a long time. Carol had furnished it simply: a couch, a kitchen table, a couple of chairs by the wood stove, beds in 2 of the 3 rooms. Practical. Exactly like her. I walked through each room slowly, but then I came back to the kitchen. There was a note tucked into the window frame above the sink. Folded once, my name on the outside in Carol's handwriting. 3 sentences. I'm not going to write them here. They belong to me, and I'm keeping them. But I'll tell you that I stood at that kitchen window for a long time after I read them, looking out at the birches and the gray January sky, and something in my chest that had been wound tight for 3 months finally let go. I built a fire in the wood stove. I made coffee. I sat on the screened porch in my coat and watched the last of the afternoon light go out of the sky over the tree line. I was going to be fine. Scott called in late January. He said he'd spoken to Linda's cousin, the real estate agent, and they'd been thinking April would be the ideal window to list. He said this the way people announce plans that have already been decided. Not a question. Not a discussion. A report. April, I said. Spring market is strong in Columbus right now, and the lot size puts us in a good bracket. Linda's cousin thinks we're looking at... Scott, when were you planning to tell me the house was for sale? A pause. Dad, we've talked about this. You can't stay in that house indefinitely. It's not realistic. You're right, I said. I can't, so I didn't. I moved out 3 weeks ago. Silence. What? I've been in Tobermory since the second week of January. Another silence. Longer. Tobermory, he said slowly. Why would you go to Tobermory? Where are you staying? My house, I said. Your mother's house. The one she bought in 2020 and left to me in her will, the will that Diane Hollis helped her draft. The will in which your name does not appear. I heard him exhale. She bought a house and never told me? She told me, I said. Which was true enough. She didn't tell you because it wasn't yours to know about. Dad. He stopped, started again. There's $41,000 missing from the joint account. I let that sit on the line between us for a moment. Is there? I said. What does that mean? It means I have bank records, transaction logs, and IP address documentation showing every transfer made from that account after your mother passed. All of them authorized from a device registered to your address in Dallas. I also have a printed copy of an email you sent to a Columbus real estate broker 3 weeks before your mother died, in which you described me as someone who would likely be agreeable to senior living within a few months of her passing. Nothing from his end. I don't want to use any of it, I said, and I meant that sincerely. But I need you to understand that I have it. I need you to understand what your mother understood about you when she set all of this up. Man, and I need you to understand one more thing clearly. The house in Columbus sells on my timeline. The proceeds are mine. What your mother left behind is mine. If I choose to give you anything at all, that is a gift. It is not something you are owed. The line was quiet, long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. Then Scott said, in a voice I hadn't heard from him in a long time, quieter, smaller, I didn't think you'd actually do this. I know, I said. Oh, that was your problem. I hung up. I put the kettle on. Diane handled the Columbus sale that spring. It closed in April, which was the timeline Scott had predicted. Just not the way he'd planned it. Not with Linda's cousin. Not with me in a senior living lobby somewhere signing papers I didn't understand. It closed on my terms, with my attorney, and the number was solid. A paid-off 4-bedroom in a good Columbus neighborhood after 41 years is worth something real. I transferred $40,000 to Neil from the proceeds. I transferred $30,000 to Scott. Yes, it was done, and then he said thank you in the evening his transfer came through. He was quiet for a moment after I told him it was done, and then he said thank you in a way that told me he was trying not to cry. Ray used to do the same thing. Hold it together right up until he couldn't. I told Neil it was what Carol would have wanted. And I meant every word of it. Scott called 2 days later. 2 days. I'll give him this. He didn't try to act like he deserved it. He didn't thank me in a way that suggested he thought the money was overdue, or that some injustice had finally been corrected. He just said he was sorry. He said it once, plainly, and then he was quiet. I told him Tobermory was worth seeing in July if he ever wanted to make the drive up. I told him Carol would have liked showing it to him. I left the rest unsaid. There are limits to what a father can do. But the rest of it is his to figure out. Linda. I did not call. I had nothing to say to her. Neil drove up in February, about 3 weeks after I'd settled in. He showed up on a Saturday afternoon in his old Civic, a bag of groceries on the back seat. No advance notice. Exactly his way. We unpacked the groceries, I made coffee, and then we walked the property together in the late afternoon. The snow was still thick up here in February. Our boots punched through the crust with every step. We went through the birches at the back of the lot, down toward the creek that runs along the eastern edge of the property, half frozen, moving slow under a skin of ice along the banks. The light was going flat and gray by the time we got back there. The kind of February light that makes everything look like an old photograph. Neil didn't say much for a while. He just walked. He had Carol's quality of being comfortable in silence, which I'd always valued in her, and which I found unexpectedly steadying in him now. After a while, he stopped and looked out at the tree line and said, "She picked a good one." "She had good taste," I said. We stood there for another minute without talking. The creek made a low sound under the ice. A crow went over. Then we turned around and walked back through the birches to the house. I made dinner, nothing complicated, just what we had. And we sat by the wood stove and talked about Ray for a while, which we hadn't done properly in years. We talked about Carol. We talked about what I was thinking of doing with the extra acreage in spring. My neighbor to the north, a woman named Patty who ran a small kayak and hiking outfitter for summer tourists, had mentioned that the additional land might be useful to her operation. There were conversations to be had about that. Nothing decided yet, but worth exploring. Neil asked if I'd thought about what came next, practically speaking. I told him I had enough to live on comfortably. The sale of the Columbus house had taken care of any gaps. The cabin was paid off. My expenses up here were modest. I wasn't looking to fill my days with busyness for its own sake. I was looking to be useful in ways that made sense. The town council meeting coming up in September about a proposed development further up the peninsula, for one. Patty had asked if I'd come and speak. I'd spent 35 years in electrical contracting, most of it on commercial builds. I understood what goes into putting something up. I also understood what gets lost in the process, and I thought that perspective was worth something in a room full of people arguing about it. Neil said he thought I should go. I told him I'd already decided I would. I'm writing this in August, on the screened porch, early morning. The coffee is hot because I've learned to sit down before I pour it instead of after. A small adjustment, but it makes a difference. But the Georgian Bay light at this hour has a quality I haven't found anywhere else. Something about the angle of it through the birches, the way it comes off the water when the air is still. Carol would have painted it. She'd taken watercolor lessons in her last couple of years. I used to tease her gently about it, and she'd gotten genuinely good. 4 of her small paintings hang in the hallway. I walk past them every morning on my way to the kitchen. I always stop at the last one. It's just trees and water and early light, nothing dramatic. But she got the color exactly right. I still talk to her sometimes. Not out loud usually, but on the long walks, when there's no one around, I'll say something. A comment about the deer tracks in the mud, or something I read that she would have found interesting, or something that happened that would have made her laugh. I don't know if she hears any of it. I'm not a man who holds strong opinions about what comes after. But the habit of it helps me stay clear on what I think, and that was always part of what she was for me. Not the whole of it. She was far more than that, but part of it. You get used to having someone who knows you that well. When that's gone, you have to learn to hold still in a different way. What Carol left me wasn't just the land, or the cedar house, or the legal protection she'd put in place, though all of that mattered more than I can say, and I won't pretend otherwise. What she left me was something harder to name. Proof, maybe. Proof that she'd seen what was coming, and trusted me to show up and handle it. I'm doing my best to be worthy of that. The fence line on the north side of the property needs checking this morning. Something has been getting into the compost again. After that, Patty wants to walk the back acreage and talk through what a trail easement might look like if we move forward with her outfitter expansion. It's a good morning, else there will be more of them. That's enough. Gary Merritt, Tobermory, August. A good life after loss isn't given to you. It doesn't arrive because someone else failed to take it. It arrives because you decided to build it. The same way you build anything worth having. Carefully, with your eyes open, and with respect for what's already there. The people who tried to take everything from me taught me one thing I didn't expect, that I had more left to build than I realized.